Welcome. Today I'm going to be talking to you about chapter 4, Sensation and Perception. And I think this is a very interesting chapter. I am going to start with asking a question. And the question is, how do we know what is real and what is not? Now, that might seem like a really basic question, but if you think about it, you wonder, what is it about our world that makes it real to us? How do we perceive the world and all of the experiences like listening and seeing and feeling? How do we know what is actually real to us and what's not? So that makes me think of a movie, one of my favorite movies of all time, and you probably heard of it. It's called The Matrix. And in The Matrix, there's a character named Morpheus, and he's talking to the main character who is Neo, and they have a conversation that is similar to what I just asked you. So I'm going to play a quick clip.
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
So Morpheus brings up a really great point about what is real to us. And it aligns with our chapter because we have to ask ourselves, what is sensation and what is perception? And how do we know what we're going through is reality and how we experience it? So when it comes to sensation and perception, our brains have to do a lot of work with generating an internal representation of the external world. Because just think about the thousands upon thousands of different sensory experiences that are out there for us to experience. And so what our brains have to do is interpret it, manipulate it, and act on it in some way, or not act on it. Because if we were to act on every single sensory stimulation or experience, it wouldn't be possible. We would be overloaded. So it starts with just ambiguous information. So what is our brain? How does our brain be able to take that in and do something with it? So the first thing we want to talk about is how our sensory systems receive information while the brain is also perceiving the information. And sensation is the process by which our sensory organs receive stimulus, um, energies from the environment, and transduce them into the electrical energy of the nervous system. And I guess I'll talk more about what that means. So we have different sensory parts of our body that will absorb the information. And so what our bodies and our brain does is it transduces it and has to turn into electrical signals. And those electrical signals will go to certain locations of the brain and determines how they're perceived. So ultimately, those sensations merge into the brain and produce a complete perceptual experience. So like thing I mentioned before about taking this ambiguous information, these infinite amounts of information, and just doing something with it. And it takes it into a certain part of the brain, and it was able to transduce it and turns it into electrical signals. So, for example, the occipital lobe will take in visual information. The temporal lobe will take in auditory information, and the parietal lobe might take in some kind of sensory input when it comes to feeling and touching and yeah, that kind of sensory information. So I talked to you about the definitions of sensation and the definition of perception. And just a reminder that sensation and perception are distinct. They're different terms, but they all go through a related process. So just a reminder, sensation is taking in stimulus energy from the environment and transducing it into electrical unit energy, into electrical energy of the nervous system. Perception is the neural processing of electrical signals, and those electrical signals form an internal mental representation inside our brain, and giving us kind of like a picture of what's happening on the outside. So one thing to emphasize is it's not the type of signal that produces distinct perceptions of the sensory organs. They're electrical signals, but rather it's where these electrical signals are processed, which really gives us that representation of what's going on the outside. Okay, so I mentioned that I'll explain transduce or transduction some more. So transduction is this transformation of sensory stimulus energy from the environment to neural impulses. And there's these things there, and there's something called perceptual thresholds, and these thresholds can change as a result of various factors. So one way to measure this is looking at the magnitude or amplitude of different sensory experiences. So some important points to understand, all sensory systems have a point of transduction, but each method is unique. And all electrical neural signals are the same, but the location of the signal indicates what it really means. So let's dig deeper into psychophysics and thresholds. As you can see here, we have different wavelengths and we have different amplitudes. And this is more of that study of psychophysics. We look at the distance between the arcs in the wavelengths, or how far away the waves are from each other. So if we're looking at short wavelengths, short wavelengths usually mean high frequency sensations, and usually determined through bluish colors. So these would be considered high-pitched sounds as well. Things that are a long wavelength, so you see how the wavelength or arcs are really wide, usually represents reddish colors or low frequency pitch sounds. Things with great amplitude, so bright colors, also could be considered loud sounds, and they have high arcs. And small amplitude things like dull colors or soft sounds could be considered like shorter wavelengths. So just a reminder that psychophysics is the study of the relationship between physical characteristics of environmental stimuli and our mental experience of them. And this can be determined by light or sound waves. So this graph gives us an example of perceptual thresholds. Perceptual thresholds can change as a result of various factors. For this reason, if you plotted a graph like the one you can see on your screen of responses on a perceptual test, it'll look more like the solid blue line than the dashed red line. So let's talk about signal detection theory. Just a reminder, perceptual thresholds can change as a result of various factors. So signal detection theory is an approach to measuring thresholds that takes into account both the intensity and the stimulus of the psychological biases for a more accurate assessment. And so looking at individual differences of people, some people might have a liberal bias when it comes to reporting perception. So they're maybe more readily a reporting perception, or they might have conservative bias, so reporting perception more hesitantly. And these ways of censoring the environment also happen in animals and plants. So similar sensory organs can provide different perceptions, just like humans, and different organs can provide similar perceptions. Organisms have evolved different sensitivities based on the demands for the environments. They could have evolved to sense different things based on their survival. And some examples would be eyes can sense different ranges of light spectrum. So humans versus bees versus birds. There are creatures that can use echolocation, such as bats and dolphins, and they use auditory perception to develop a spatial map of the environment, like vision does for most animals. So the photos that are on the right have been manipulated to show the representation of bee vision. So there are different ways that bees will perceive the environment visually than humans. So another way to represent signal detection is through a matrix, and this can help us identify individuals who might have a conservative versus liberal response style. So if you take a look at the right side, a person who is more conservative might be more cautious and therefore more likely to report no stimulus, increasing the number of misses, but also correct rejections. And we can use these figures to kind of represent two types of response bias, liberal versus conservative, when assessing people's conservative bias. Another idea that'd be important to know in this chapter is the idea of adaptation. And adaptation is a phenomena where an individual stops noticing stimulus that remains constant over time, resulting in enhanced detection of stimulus changes. So there's different ways this happens. Sensory adaptation will occur at the level of sensory receptors, and the adaptation occurs in perceptual centers of the brain. The after effects are opposing sensory or perceptual distortions that happen after the adaptation happens. So the benefit of adaptation is that our senses ignore unhelpful information and optimize sensitivity to more important information. And one example would be dark adaptation. So what that means is our ability to adjust our eyes to darkness so we can see at night. So that'll be an example of adaptation. Some other examples of after effects include if you see a black spot after looking at a light bulb, seeing opposing movement on still surfaces after looking at a waterfall. Another sensation that you might have encountered is if you're on a treadmill. So you're on a treadmill walking or running or something like that, and you get off the treadmill and you still have that feeling like you're still moving or have some kind of unsteady feeling. As you'll see in your reading, there's something called Weber's law, and that's just noticeable difference that's based on the proportional strengths of two stimuli. So what does that mean? When you go into the inquisitive assignment or you do your reading, I'll give you some examples. But let's just say that you have two buttons that play a sound, but it also plays a sound on a scale of 1 to 10. And the lowest tone would be a 1, the highest tone would be at a 10. And if you were to compare tones 1 and 2 and tones 9 and 10, the difference between 1 and 2 would be the same difference between 9 and 10. But the difference between 1 and 2 should be more noticeable because of the overall intensity of both of the two stimuli is lower. I'll give you another example. So you could have a holding a bowling ball in one hand, and you have a cotton ball that lands on your hand at the same time. So you might not be able to feel the object because you might not be able to feel the cotton ball because the ratio is so low. However, according to Weber's law, if you had a cotton ball in your hand, but then you had a feather land in your hand, the ratio of each object will be much greater. So therefore, according to Weber's law, you'd be able to feel it easier.